Pilots, what's the scariest stuff you've seen while flying? Not a pilot, but I had a front row seat to chaos from the airplane bathroom. I was mid-bowel movement, like midway through a truly heroic effort, when the captain came over the intercom with a quick warning. Turbulence incoming, buckle up. Everyone on board obeyed instantly. Flight attendants strapped in. Passengers went stiff with attention. Everyone but me, because I was locked in the lab, mid-poop, praying to any deity listening that this wouldn't be that kind of turbulence. I've flown through turbulence before. It's bumpy, annoying, usually not that big a deal. But this was next level. I'm about to get launched into low orbit with my pants down kind of turbulence. By some miracle of timing and intestinal discipline, I managed to finish my business, wipe up, and flush. Didn't want to risk leaving anything behind when the plane dropped like a roller coaster. I was instantly airborne. I bounced off the ceiling, slammed into the floor, back up again, ricocheted off the sink, and went face first into the toilet lid. It was pure chaos. I curled up the best I could, covered my head, and just prayed for mercy. Eventually, by sheer panic and physics, I wedged myself under the toilet where I rode it out like a traumatized raccoon in a trash can. When the turbulence finally ended, I crawled out, pants still around my ankles, and opened the door to a mix of laughter, confusion, and very real concern. Apparently, from the outside, it was just a bit of a bumpy ride until they heard the screams, the bangs, the crashing, and then silence. A few passengers thought I'd actually died in there. Bonus detail I forgot to mention, I never got my pants up. I rode that whole sky rodeo with my butt out. Truly humbling. Airline captain here. Closest I've come to biting it. I'm a commercial airline captain based out of LAX, and this is the closest I've come to a true emergency in the air. On modern commercial jets, cabin pressurization is handled by something called bleed air. Essentially, high-pressure air taken from the engines and the auxiliary power unit, APU, a small engine in the tail of the plane. You can't breathe unassisted at cruising altitudes, so the bleed air is used to pressurize the cabin to a safe, breathable level, usually equivalent to 8,000 feet or lower. There are usually 3 sources of bleed air, 2 from the engines and 1 from the APU. That redundancy is intentional. If one fails, you still have 2 backups, and the aircraft can legally and safely operate with one system down, as long as the other 2 are functioning. On this particular flight, the bleed air system from engine number 2 had already been deferred by maintenance, marked as inoperative but not critical. So we took off with the remaining 2, the number 1 engine bleed and the APU running as a backup. We rotated off the runway, and just after takeoff, the APU failed. Now we're flying with only one source of bleed air, engine number 1. That's not ideal, but it's a short flight and we're staying relatively low. I'm cautiously optimistic. I sent a message via ACARS, a satellite-based texting system, to our dispatch and maintenance teams, letting them know what happened. But they never had time to reply. As we climbed through 25,000 feet, I took a breath and instantly felt something wrong. Instead of air rushing into my lungs, it felt like it was leaving. My eyes shot to the cabin altitude gauge. It was reading 8,000 feet and climbing fast. At the exact same time, the ICAs, our onboard alert system, lit up bleed 1 fail. With that, we had 0 functional bleed air sources, no pressurization, no conditioned air, and no way to breathe at high altitude. This wasn't a minor system error. This was the kind of failure that has led to fatal crashes, like Helios Flight 522, where the crew and passengers lost consciousness due to rapid decompression. Instinct took over. I ripped off my sunglasses and headset and slapped on my full-face oxygen mask with smoke goggles, rated for pure oxygen even above 40,000 feet. My first officer did the same. Step 1, save the pilots. If we're incapacitated, no one survives. Next, We declared an emergency and initiated a rapid descent, nosing down to our maximum airspeed and deploying speed brakes to shed altitude as quickly as possible. ATC gave us immediate clearance to 10,000 feet and expertly vectored traffic out of our way. SoCal airspace is one of the busiest in the world, but they cleared a path without hesitation. The cabin altitude kept climbing, but never reached the threshold that would automatically drop the passenger oxygen masks. Still, it got high enough that passengers definitely noticed something was off. Difficulty breathing, a hot cabin, a strange pressure sensation, but no one had the full picture. We returned to LAX and landed on the longest available runway, fire trucks standing by just in case. Fortunately, no injuries were reported. The cabin had gotten uncomfortably hot without air conditioning, but we had avoided true disaster. Once we parked at the gate and deplaned, I made a calm, carefully worded announcement to the passengers, keeping things vague so as not to scare anyone unnecessarily. "Just a maintenance issue," I said. 12 of the passengers were Chinese tourists, clearly upset by the delay. I spoke with their translator and gave her a more thorough explanation of what actually happened. As she translated, I watched their expressions shift from frustration to shock to realization and finally to gratitude. Before I walked away, all 12 of them bowed to me. I've never experienced anything like that before or since. We swapped to a healthy aircraft and completed the flight about 3 hours behind schedule. The passengers probably told friends later that their flight was delayed by some maintenance thing, and that's fine. I slept very well that night. Had a few close calls as a pilot, but here are the standouts. One time, I landed my plane, a small Cessna, and as I touched down, smoke started filling the cockpit. Thankfully, it didn't happen mid-air. I was able to taxi off the runway and shut everything down, but I still had to physically push the aircraft the rest of the way off. Not exactly how you want to end a flight. I've also narrowly avoided 2 mid-air collisions. The first was caused by a new pilot who wasn't where he was supposed to be. He drifted way off from where he should have been in the pattern, and I had to take quick action to avoid a bad day for both of us. The second was actually due to bad info from ATC. They told me there was traffic at my 11 o'clock. I scanned like crazy, nothing. Turns out, the other aircraft was actually coming at me from 2 o'clock. Again, caught it just in time to avoid a collision. Heart skipped a beat with that one. But the most surreal, most beautiful moment I've had in the sky, I was flying along at cruise altitude when a meteor burned up directly in front of me. Same altitude, straight ahead. I couldn't tell how far away it was, but it was close enough to light up the cockpit. It glowed bright, shifted through a full spectrum of colors as it disintegrated, and then was gone. Still one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Navy carrier pilot here. The craziest thing I've ever done in an airplane. This story isn't about what I saw. It's about what I couldn't see. I had joined a squadron on deployment near Guam for a few months. Since it had been about 6 months since I'd last landed on a carrier, I needed to get current again, basically doing a few day and night carrier landings to prove I was still up to speed. My first night back with them, the plan was simple. I'd get 2 nighttime carrier landings or traps. I'd launch as the first aircraft in the recovery cycle, trap, get shot off the deck again, and then come back as the last aircraft to land. Nothing unusual. We do this all the time to keep qualifications current. The only twist was that I'd be flying both passes myself. That night, it was completely overcast. No moonlight, no stars, just black. And we were in the middle of the ocean. When you descend through clouds at night with zero ambient light, you truly can't tell where the sky ends and the sea begins. It's pitch black, disorienting, and honestly surreal. As we start the descent toward the ship, we're first in the conga line of aircraft coming in on 2-minute intervals. Then we hear a call over the radio from paddles, the landing signal officers on the back of the ship who guide you down. 99, the deck is moving. Translation: the flight deck is pitching, rolling, or heaving more than usual. Not great, but not uncommon either. Just adds another layer of challenge. We're flying down the needles, our glide path indicators toward the ship. At 400 feet, 1 mile out, we're still in the clouds, no visual reference. We get to the 3/4 mile point where control hands us off to paddles with the standard call. Show you on and on, 3/4 mile. Call the ball. At that point, you're expected to visually acquire the ball, a light system on the carrier that shows if you're high, low, or right on glide path. But we look outside and see nothing, just black. So instead of calling the ball, we say, Clara ship, which basically means we can't see the ship at all. Paddles comes back with 601, taxi light on. Translation, they can't see us either. So we flip on our taxi light to help them spot us. A second later, Paddles calls. Paddles contact. Now they have visual on us and start talking us down, giving verbal corrections to guide us in. Because at this point, we're probably passing through 150 feet and still haven't broken out of the clouds. Finally, maybe 3 to 5 seconds before touchdown, we punch through. Rain is hammering the canopy. We barely spot the deck, and then boom, we're down and hooked in. Came to a full stop in just a couple seconds. It's raining so hard we can hardly see the taxi director waving us forward. They get us up to the bow, catapults, hook us in, and launch us right back into the darkness to do it all again. Thankfully, the weather improved a bit on the second pass. The deck was more stable and visibility was slightly better, but that first trap still stands as the wildest, sketchiest thing I've ever done in an airplane. My sibling once asked our great uncle, who had been a commercial pilot for over 30 years, what the weirdest thing he'd ever seen while flying was. Without missing a beat, he just said God. Then he got up and went to take a nap. We're still not sure if he was being serious, joking, or just messing with us, but nobody ever followed up. I was flying a Cessna 172 into an uncontrolled airfield I'd flown into 100 times before. Routine stuff. As far as I knew, skydiving had been banned there for the past 5 years. What I didn't know was that they'd recently started allowing jumps again on a case-by-case basis. While inbound, I was making my usual position calls over CTAF when I suddenly heard, "Skydiver in the air." My first thought was, I really hope they're not anywhere near me. Seconds later, there he was. A skydiver about 20 yards off my wing. I froze for a second, immediately picturing him going straight through my prop. Then came the panic. Oh God, please don't let me kill this guy. After that, it quickly turned into confusion and anger. What the hell just happened? Why didn't the jump pilot call this out better? I looked around, expecting to see the jump plane circling, maybe guiding him in, but it was gone. Turns out, the pilot had flown his friend out to do a personal skydive over his local field, then just departed back to their home airport, leaving the guy to land solo. No coordination. No proper callouts. Nothing. I never did find out who the skydiver was. I just know how close it came to being a tragedy, and how lucky we both were that day. My dad once told me about something wild he experienced while flying a 737 somewhere over Nevada, he thinks, on a return flight to Toronto. It was late in the evening, so visibility outside was limited. Suddenly, off the left side of the aircraft, he saw this incredibly bright ball of light streaking across the sky at high speed. He and his co-pilot had no idea what it was. They weren't the only ones confused. Other pilots in the area started calling in over the radio, all asking the same thing. What the hell is that? The object kept moving rapidly across the sky before finally vanishing into the distance. A few days later, my dad found out what it actually was: a missile launched by a U.S. Navy submarine. Still, I can't help but wonder how many passengers were sitting by the windows that night, convinced they just witnessed a UFO. I did my pilot training at an airfield that had a waterway running right up to the approach and to the runway. It wasn't uncommon to see sailboats heading out to sea as you came into land. Because of that, and because the runway was plenty long, we'd usually fly a slightly higher approach just to be safe. Not long after my first solo, I was back at the field doing my run-up, waiting for one of the regulars to land his low-wing sport plane. He was a solid pilot, experienced. But on this particular day, he clearly didn't see the sailboat crossing just short of the runway, and its mast was directly in his flight path. He hit it. The plane clipped the mast and instantly cartwheeled down the runway, breaking apart as it tumbled. It was one of the most surreal things I've ever witnessed. I taxied my plane back to the tie downs to get out of the way, then rushed over to help. Somehow, the wreck didn't catch fire, but the damage was serious. The pilot had broken both wrists and suffered multiple fractures. What made it worse? He was a surgeon. I don't know if he was ever able to return to work. That accident stuck with me. From that day on, I was always extra cautious on approach. No matter how familiar the airfield felt, nothing was ever routine again. My dad isn't a pilot anymore, but he used to be, and he once told me a harrowing story from his flying days. He was coming in for a landing in his Cessna when, without warning, his plane plowed straight into a flock of geese hidden in a thick bank of fog. The impact shattered the windshield, sending blood and feathers flying into the cockpit, covering him and his passenger. Miraculously, he managed to land the plane safely, but the experience left him deeply shaken. Though he didn't give up flying, the fear of bird strikes, especially from large birds like geese, stuck with him ever since. Those birds had done serious damage to the small aircraft, a stark reminder of how dangerous flying can be. It's a story that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. This happened on my first solo flight, without an instructor on board, just a couple of laps around the traffic pattern. The takeoff went smoothly, and my first 2 laps were perfect. I nailed a couple of radio calls and was feeling pretty confident, thinking, yeah, I've got this. But lap number 3 went fine, right up until I started setting up my final approach. That's when my GTN 750, a fancy navigation/radio system, gave me a warning about a Cessna 1 mile out at the same altitude. I figured it was no big deal since I had the plane in sight and had already confirmed with the control tower that he was landing on a parallel runway. Then, out of nowhere, this guy zips under me, missing by only 200 to 300 feet. It sounds like a decent amount of room, but trust me, it felt way too close for comfort in busy airspace. I should have just punched the throttle and circled back to reattempt the landing, but the other plane was already clear of my path before the adrenaline even kicked in. What made it worse was the fact that I was flying a low-wing aircraft, so I couldn't see below me, and he was in a high-wing plane, meaning he couldn't see above him either. Neither of us had a clear visual on each other, and the tower immediately yelled at the other guy to get out of my way. In the end, I landed safely, but it was definitely a wake-up call about staying on top of situational awareness. I'm not a pilot, but a few years ago, I took some flight lessons just for the experience. One day, we were practicing landings, and as we lined up for a final approach, everything seemed normal. But as we descended, my instructor noticed a shadow on the ground slightly to our right. It was another plane, also aiming for our runway, and it was flying above us. We had already radioed our intentions, but I'm not sure if the other pilot had. Without hesitation, my instructor took control of the plane and pulled us off the approach. The other plane didn't land. It just kept going. We circled around, made another attempt, and landed safely. In the end, it turned out that nobody had noticed the other aircraft. We were lucky to spot in time. It was a pretty surreal experience. I'm not a pilot, but I'm an Air Force Combat Systems officer. We were flying along a military training route, MTR, Basically an area cleared for military jets to practice maneuvers without having to worry about civilian aircraft. We were cruising at 300 feet AGL, moving at 420 knots, when our CAS, the collision alert system using onboard radar, suddenly starts blaring at us. We all start looking around, but we don't see anything nearby. Then, out of nowhere, some idiot in a small prop plane who wasn't even squawking suddenly climbs right into our flight path, about 50 feet off our nose. The pilot immediately jerks the controls to the right, and we narrowly avoid a mid-air collision. It was one of those moments where everything could have gone south in an instant. I was on final approach in a Cessna 172, and as I pulled the power back to maintain the glide slope, the engine suddenly started to sputter. The prop began to slow down more than I was comfortable with. I quickly added power, recovered, and made a normal landing. However, I knew it needed to be checked out, so I had the engine inspected afterward. I was flying a Cessna 152, which is a bit smaller than a C-172, when thunderstorms developed on either side of us. They formed pretty quickly, and we thought we might have to turn back. But just when we were about to give up, we found a big enough gap to fly through. The windshield even got nice and clean in the process. Another time, I saw the engine start to shake when a part of the oil system failed. For a moment, I thought the engine was going to quit, and I was mentally preparing for an emergency landing in a field or on a small road. Luckily, we ended up stuck at one power setting, still not ideal, but we were able to fly it back to the airport without further issues. Back when he served in the Air Force, my dad worked as a mechanical engineer on Lockheed C-130 Hercules planes. One of his key responsibilities was overseeing the pre-flight checklist, a thorough inspection every aircraft had to pass before takeoff. He also trained new mechanics, and on the first day, he always drilled one crucial rule into them: always check the engines for bird nests. If a plane had been grounded for a while, seagulls or pigeons would sometimes build nests inside the engines. While the birds themselves weren't a major threat to the machinery, turning on an engine with one still inside meant hours of gruesome cleanup. One day, while demonstrating engine power control to a group of rookies, my dad realized they'd skipped the bird check. Instead of reminding them, he decided to let them learn the hard way. He casually stepped back as the pilot fired up the engine, and a split second later, the unlucky seagull inside was turned into a grisly explosion of blood and guts, drenching the trainees from head to toe. Needless to say, none of them ever forgot to check for birds again. I wasn't the pilot, but this happened on a commercial flight, and we were never told exactly what went wrong. The cabin suddenly started filling with smoke, and it had a very strong burning smell. I was sitting by the window, and the wall next to it got so hot that it was uncomfortable to touch. The scariest part was seeing the flight attendants panic. They were rushing up and down the aisles, urgently feeling all the overhead bins, checking for something on fire. They kept asking us to check our devices, making sure nothing was overheating. People around me started having panic attacks, and I couldn't help but wonder how it would feel to die in a situation like this and what might happen. The pilot eventually made an announcement that we were close enough to the airport to continue on for about 15 to 20 more minutes and then make an emergency landing. When we finally touched down, the runway was lined with fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue teams waiting for us. They didn't let us off the plane right away. We had to sit there for a while before firefighters boarded and escorted us off. They never told us what caused the issue. A couple of days later, I had to fly back with the same airline. While I was checking my bags, the employee said, "Oh my God, you were on that flight?" That was bad. He gave me a $15 in-flight credit and suggested I call the airline for more compensation. I never did, but to this day, I still wonder what actually happened. I'm not a pilot, but my dad is. So one day, we were flying out of Las Vegas, and shortly after takeoff, we nearly collided with another aircraft. The other pilot never radioed in to the tower or mentioned anything about landing. It was like he was in his own little world, completely oblivious to everything around him. We were flying a single-engine Cessna, and this guy was in a twin-engine Beechcraft. We came so close to each other, within about 200 feet, that we could actually see each other. Honestly, it was close enough that we probably could have smelled whatever he was freaking out about, but he seemed completely unaware. That pilot was so clueless. I wouldn't have been surprised if he thought the runway was the actual Las Vegas Strip. He used to fly a 182 on floats and, on many occasions, would play family airlines to help relatives get to weddings and events that were just too far for a drive. One of these trips was from Vancouver to Kamloops, a flight that's about 200 miles. He flew VFR, which was pretty straightforward. He would head up the Fraser Valley, and when he reached the town of Hope, he'd go through the gap in the mountains where the Coquihalla River and Highway 5 ran through. From there, it was a simple flight northeast along Highway 5 into Kamloops. The morning flight went smoothly, and his 3 passengers made it to their event without issue. But on the return flight that afternoon, things took a turn. The sky, which had been clear earlier, began to cloud over quickly, rolling in thick and fast from the forested valley sides. Before long, his little plane was enveloped by the clouds. He knew his heading and stuck to it, but as the sky turned completely white, he realized how risky it was. With no GPS, he had to rely on dead reckoning, and even being a couple of degrees off could lead them straight into a mountainside. His passengers, completely unaware of the growing tension, were busy talking about their day. He tried to climb above the cloud cover, but he knew that could be just as dangerous. His Cessna wasn't pressurized, and if he popped out above the cloud, there was a good chance he'd be staring at a white, featureless sky, with no landmarks to guide him. His only hope was to get past Hope, drop down, and maybe fly under the cloud cover all the way back to Vancouver. That, he said, was the one time he was truly scared in the plane. As the miles ticked by, he still hadn't seen Hope. But then, out of nowhere, the clouds suddenly broke and the valley opened up below him, with a high cloud ceiling above. He made it. He hadn't needed to climb after all. They landed safely at the South Airport, and no one even commented on the strange, white haze they'd flown through. That experience didn't exactly inspire me to become a pilot. I was flying a Cessna 172 with my instructor, heading toward Blythe on our way to the San Diego hangar when a sandstorm suddenly kicked up beneath us. The sand was so close that I swear it was causing the landing gear tires to spin. This was part of a 3-leg check flight, and we had just landed at Big Bear, California, for fuel when this intense, hot, low-pressure system moved in. It came in fast, like really fast. It was pushing temperatures up to about 120 degrees, and the air was already thin, making everything feel a lot more challenging. As we were fueling up, We saw a kid on his solo flight attempt to take off. He managed to get airborne, but it wasn't long before he just fell out of the sky. The heat and the thin air made it tough for him to get enough speed, and he ran out of runway. Instead of aborting and listening to the tower's instructions, he tried to pull up, but it was too late. The crash was fatal. He couldn't get enough lift, and that was the end of it. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, especially in extreme conditions. Navy helicopter pilot here. I've got two experiences that would tie for the scariest. There was this awful once-per-revolution thumping coming from the rotor head. I'm on final approach, trying to land, when the torque gauges suddenly went dead, signaling a double engine failure. Fortunately, the engines were still running fine, even though the gauges decided to take a vacation. Then, there was the time the rotor RPM unexpectedly dropped for no apparent reason. To top it off, the master warning light came on, signaling an engine failure. But just as quickly as it dropped, the engine restarted itself, and everything was fine. Still, I'm not gonna lie, I nearly shit myself in that moment. And let's not forget, teaching people how to land on ships at night, that's a whole other level of terrifying. Bush pilot here. One time, I loaded up an aircraft with a 200 kilograms dead wild boar. Everything seemed fine as we climbed to cruising altitude, but then, out of nowhere, the boar starts squealing like crazy. The straps holding it in place couldn't keep it contained, and its head popped out of the bag, locking eyes with me before going absolutely berserk. I've never been so terrified in my life. To make things worse, I was flying through clouds with no autopilot, and the only thing I had for defense was a screwdriver. Air traffic control couldn't hear me over the screeching chaos, so they refused to let me into their airspace. I had no choice but to find some random strip and land there. The villagers still think I owe them a pig for that one. I've been pretty lucky in my short time flying, only about 60 hours so far and still in training. But the scariest thing I've encountered was a bald eagle that flew just 8 feet from my left wingtip. We only avoided a collision because my instructor and I reacted fast, diving and rolling the plane as quickly as we could. Those big birds can be a serious hazard to small aircraft. I was in a Cessna 172S. So, a word of advice: watch out for your animal pilots. I had a close call with a twin-engine aircraft flying at the wrong altitude, heading straight toward me. It was like oncoming traffic in the next lane over, super close. To make things even more intense, the speed difference between us was about 300 knots. The guy never made a sound on the radio, so I had no idea he was even in the vicinity until he was already behind me. I'm not a pilot, but I'm a skydiver. We had cleared the airspace over the airport for a jump, and were getting ready to make our jump run. While in free fall, I noticed a small plus shape below me, which quickly grew larger. It hit me that a student pilot from a nearby flight school hadn't properly cleared the airspace. I zipped past his Cessna at terminal velocity, just inches away. A slight miscalculation, and I would have gone straight through that little plane. I landed without incident, but I'm pretty sure the pilot never realized how close he came to disaster that day. Back in 2000, my husband was flying a Cessna 172. We decided to take the day off, kids were in school, and it was a beautiful September day. We had plans to fly through the Twin Towers, circle around the Statue of Liberty, and then head down to Atlantic City for lunch and some gambling. As we neared the Twin Towers, we found ourselves in the middle of a busy pattern with 2 helicopters and 3 other small planes. Not thrilled about the crowd, we decided to circle the Statue of Liberty instead and then continued on to Atlantic City. After a nice lunch and a little luck at the casino, we started heading home. That's when Atlantic City Airport called us on the radio and informed us that 2 Air Force jets had broken the restricted zone and we needed to divert 2 clicks east, maintaining an altitude of 2,500 feet. My husband was shocked, saying, "I didn't think they could do that," to which I joked they did it in Top Gun. Then, ACY warned us to watch for jet wash, because the jets would be passing beneath us. The first jet flew under us, and even though we were tightly strapped in, our heads slammed into the roof. The second jet was only 5 seconds behind, and we hit the roof again. My husband kept his cool, but I was digging my nails into my palms so hard that I had bruises the next day. When we landed, a guy from the air club asked how our flight went. My husband just said, "It was an ass sweat kind of flight." My father was a commercial pilot for over 35 years and had been flying for more than 45 years in total. Over the course of his career, he's experienced all sorts of wild situations, from searching for debris after the Challenger disaster to the chaos he faced during the 9/11 attacks. He's even spent time towing banners along the Jersey Shore. But the craziest story I always ask him to retell, the one I can never get enough of, took place off the coast of New South Wales, Australia, in the late 1970s. My dad and his crew were in a standard traffic pattern, waiting to land, when they got a strange delay. The air traffic control tower informed them that there was an unidentified flying object showing up on the radar. For a while, they just kept circling in the pattern, waiting for other planes to land so they could be cleared for their descent. Eventually, the tower got a more precise location for the object, and as they looked out the windows, they spotted a cigar-shaped craft flying at about the same altitude as them, moving slowly through the sky. At that moment, everyone on board who could see it, crew and passengers alike, audibly gasped. My dad says that's the part that really shook him, the eerie silence and collective disbelief when everyone realized what they were witnessing. The object eventually disappeared off the radar and was out of sight, and they were cleared to land without further incident. Nothing else came of it, but that story became my absolute favorite to hear from him as a kid. Even now, it's still the one that sticks with me the most. I had a close call with a helicopter once, about 30 to 40 feet off my wing. I had just landed in an uncontrolled field, making my usual radio calls as I came in. As I was touching down, I heard a helicopter also coming in to land and refuel. Since I didn't need to refuel, I completed my checklist, turned the plane around, and went back to the opposite end of the runway. The end I was using to take off was far from the fuel farm, so I figured I had some time. I waited for a few other planes to land, one of which was a gorgeous red biplane, and made all the necessary radio calls. Once the runway was clear, I taxied out, took off, and as I passed the far end near the fuel farm, my iPad suddenly screamed, "Warning traffic 9 o'clock, 100 feet below." I was like, "What the heck?" and immediately yanked the yoke to the right. That's when I saw a helicopter shoot up past my left wing, way too close for comfort. It turns out the guy had finished refueling and just took off without making any radio calls or listening to any of the calls on the frequency. I definitely had some choice words over the radio. As the pilot who was about to line up to take off after me saw the near miss, he yelled, "Shit." After that, I made sure to always keep a close eye on helicopters. Definitely added a little extra excitement to the day. My brother's been learning to fly, and I went up with him once to do some touch and goes. One thing that really stuck with me was when they started talking about where we would land if we lost engine power. It wasn't something I had really thought about beforehand, but I guess it's part of flying. Gotta have a plan for everything, even the worst case scenarios. My grandfather was a pilot back in the 50s, back when carrying guns on planes was apparently a thing. He once told me a crazy story about a passenger who had a nervous breakdown mid-flight. In a panic, the guy shot out a window, thinking he saw something on the wing. The plane depressurized and chaos followed. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. One more story for you. Flying out of Palomar Airport with a grumpy old World War II pilot teaching me to fly. He says it's time for an hour of touch and goes. We land, and I'm feeling pretty good because I've got the landings down. I get in the pattern, call the tower, Cessna XXX in the pattern for touch and goes, and they guide me around. It's a slow day, so I'm getting tons of practice and things are going smoothly. Then an emergency happens, and they keep me flying the downwind leg, waiting for instructions. But those instructions never come. For about 10 minutes. Now I'm outside the pattern, but I can see the old drag strip, so I know exactly where I am. I call in again, and the tower's a little mad, probably at themselves for losing track of me. They turn me around, get me landed, and tell me that's enough touch and goes for the day. Meanwhile, my instructor was sitting in the airport eatery, probably a bit worried too. I was on about an 8-mile final, working on my commercial license in a Cessna 172. As I was checking my instruments during the approach, I glanced up and saw a black dot directly in front of me. It wasn't moving, and in that split second, I realized I was on a collision course. I immediately pushed the yoke forward as hard as I could. Just 1 or 2 seconds later, a bird flew right above me, barely missing. This wasn't me, but my dad. While he was flying, his escorts were targeted by a ground-to-air missile. They climbed to avoid the threat, leaving him as the only target. Fortunately, the missile missed by just a couple hundred feet. I'm not a pilot, but my dad is a private pilot, and he flies a Cessna 172. One day, we were flying into this tiny airport, which was owned and operated by a single person. We were in the traffic pattern, waiting to land because another plane was taking off. But that plane didn't make it. I remember my dad describing the air as thin. The plane started its climb, but then suddenly dropped like a rock. It crashed. The pilot, a man, died on impact, and his wife was taken to the hospital. We never found out what happened to her after that. The couple was older and the parents of the airport's owner, who was working communications at the time of the crash. They had been visiting him. I can still vividly remember how the plane dropped, the smoke rising, and the sight of the fire trucks and ambulances. We had to wait to land, watching the smoke billow and hearing the broken up communications over the radio. It was a haunting experience. I was on an L-1011 flying back to Atlanta, and we ended up circling the city for what felt like forever. Then, out of nowhere, the co-pilot walks down the aisle, opens a hatch in the floor right next to me, and starts cranking a handle like his life depends on it. He looks up at me and casually says, "The landing gear wouldn't come down." I just stared at him and replied, "Well, that's good to know." I'm not a pilot, but one time I was flying with my dad in our 4-seater plane when we got uncomfortably close to a vulture. It was so close that we could actually see the individual feathers on its wings, and it got tossed around in our wake. The bird was perfectly lined up with our approach path, and if it had collided with the wing, it would have made for a rough landing. But if it had hit the prop, well, let's just say we would have been in for a very vertical landing. On my first solo cross-country flight, which was only my third time flying alone, by the way, the conditions seemed fine when I took off. At the surface, everything looked good, but higher up, the thunderstorm started developing a bit earlier than forecasted. The flight out was smooth. There were some cumulus clouds, and the turbulence was a bit noticeable due to the thermals, but nothing unusual for an August afternoon. By the time I landed, taxied back, and took off again to head home, those storms had definitely started to grow. I ended up flying under what was probably a developing thunderstorm on my third solo. While it was clear in terms of cloud clearance and not fully developed, just some big gray clouds, avoiding it wasn't really an option. There's a lot of development in the area, and taking a detour would have caused a pretty significant deviation from my flight plan, something that made me nervous on my first solo. Thankfully, everything worked out just fine, and now I'm close to getting my private pilot's license. But that little added stress definitely made the flight more nerve-wracking than it needed to be. Oh, and I also came within about 30 feet of one bald eagle and 50 feet of another, both soaring at 3,500 feet. It was an amazing sight, seeing such a magnificent creature up there doing its thing. But I'll admit, I was definitely thinking that a collision with a bird that size would have been disastrous for both of us. Funny enough, that happened during one of my prep flights for the solo cross country. So, it seems that route was always a bit more eventful. Honestly, I'm glad I don't have any truly wild stories yet. With how little flying time I have, I'd have to be seriously unlucky to encounter anything like that. And I'm happy to keep it that way for now. I was flying a DA-40 through some mountainous terrain with less than ideal weather conditions. As I tried to cross a ridge past the point of no return, I got stuck in a serious sink. I pushed the throttle and prop all the way forward, but no matter whether I pitched for VX or VI, I was still sinking at about 200 feet per minute. I cleared the ridge by just about 200 feet, but being in a situation where you're giving it everything you've got and still descending into a mountain is definitely something I never want to experience again. I'm not a pilot, but I did witness an oh crap moment firsthand. One summer, I was working in a nice kids camp, installing access control systems, locks, card swipes, cameras, and so on. The camp was located on a large lake, which had zip lines running across it. These zip lines were well marked, and any pilot should have been able to spot them from the air. On one particular day, I heard a bomber approaching for a refill. Suddenly, the pilot saw the zip lines, but it was almost too late. I've never seen a plane climb so fast, especially a bird that large. It was a close call, and one I'll never forget. My fiancé was flying on a military aircraft for work, just part of the job, when he happened to glance out the window and notice something unsettling. One of the turbines on the wing was billowing smoke. Trying to keep it cool, he radioed the cockpit and said, guys, I think our wing is on fire. The pilot replied, damn. Again? Hang on, killing the engines. That moment, my fiancé says, was pure terror. Because if the plane went down, the priority wasn't saving him. It was preserving the high-value equipment on board, even at the cost of his life. That's just how the mission was structured. They shut down the engines, coasted silently through the sky for a couple minutes, then powered back up. Everything stabilized, and they landed safely. But it shook him. What made it worse? The other aircraft was grounded for an even more serious mechanical issue. So this was the only operational plane. It had to stay in the air no matter what, so they kept flying it, smoking turbine and all, until the backup got fixed. My fiancé wasn't even part of the regular flight crew. He was only on board because the usual guy was sick and he happened to have the training and clearance. After that experience, he swore he'd never complain again about loading or unloading gear on the tarmac. Nothing compares to the feeling of watching your wing catch fire midair. I had a similar experience, but this time, both of us were calling in, which really confused me. The lesson was on the traffic pattern, too. Perfect timing, right? I called downwind, and he called downwind. I called base, and he called base. I started to wonder if he was landing on a different runway, maybe one perpendicular to ours, and had mixed up the runway number in use. I kept scanning the other runways, nervous we might both land at the intersection. We both called final. He was flying a low-wing plane above us, and I was in a high-wing plane below. The perfect recipe for disaster. Then I spotted him about 30 feet above us, probably 200 to 300 feet up. My heart dropped. The instructor immediately pulled to the right and gunned the throttle. He was rattled too, and we didn't speak much for the rest of the pattern. I asked him if he was okay, and he nodded, asking the same of me. I think, looking back, I might have saved both of us just by staying alert and being lucky. It turns out the other pilot was flying the mirror pattern. According to the flight manual, our runway was designated for a right-hand pattern because of the dangerous hillsides on the left. But this guy was flying a left-hand pattern, so we were both on downwind and base at the same time, just opposite sides of the runway. To make it more interesting, he was flying in a rented plane for his flying exam. The lesson I took away from that day was the importance of specifying your position in radio calls, especially when flying patterns that aren't the standard left-hand turns. It could have been a very different story if we hadn't been so careful. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.